Salud.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Here's to 2021.
It's a 21.
Yes.
Come on, 21.
Good idea, Edward, on the wine and the fire. Thank you for this.
Well, no reason for us to be uncivilized, right?
So we're here today with Dr. Edward Hart, and this is his beautiful backyard, actually, and we're enjoying fire and outside in beautiful Charleston, South Carolina, which has been home to you for many years.
Pretty much forever, except for graduate school.
Graduate school.
Yes.
In Columbia.
Yeah, didn't go far. 2 hours north, that's about all I could do.
It's understandable. This is such a beautiful place. So, next week we'll be releasing a video, which is a performance that Saundra DeAthos-Meers and I gave of one of Edward's compositions called A Hymn. And we're going to talk about that piece a little bit more later, but getting to know your music a bit over these last few years, Edward, I think Kayleen and I have noticed, besides the fact that it's instantly sort of attractive and interesting and engaging music, there are often ties to this part of the world.
Yes. Well, you know, you kind of have to go with what you know. And I've naturally kind of gravitated towards programmatic elements in my music. And as we talked about, this is my home. I've been in this state forever now. Of course, I've traveled, and I love to travel, and I love other places. But this is a place that I really know. And it's been sort of a bottomless source of inspiration. I don't really need to do much more than walk out the door, whether it's natural beauty or the beauty of the city itself, or it's really rich, interesting, sometimes troubling history, and everything that's going through now, which is endlessly fascinating for me.
So, I wanted to ask you, I know that you grew up downtown Charleston, and you've told us some stories about what drew you to music. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us some of those stories?
Well, sure. So my family on my mother's side were Germans, and they were latecomers to Charleston, as it were. They came in the early 19th century, so that they're barely Charlestonians, I guess. That's not true, of course. But our patriarch on that side was a guy named John Siegling, and he was from Erfurt, Thuringia, in the middle of Germany. And he had a wonderful story. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically he, as a teenager, moved to Paris and then London to learn the piano and harp trade. He built pianos and harps, worked for the House of Erard, set out to make his fortune in the New World. Well, actually, the family legend was he flipped a coin, and one side was going to be St. Petersburg, Russia. The other side was going to be New York. New York came up, landed in New York. There was some terrible outbreak. That seems very topical now, doesn't it? And then he stayed on the boat, which ended up in Charleston. Came to Charleston, set up shop, literally, and started importing harps and pianos from Europe. Had a very interesting career. Had a branch in Havana, Cuba, which is neat. Just had a Forrest Gump kind of life in which he just did everything and knew everybody. So anyway, that music store stayed in business until the early 1970s. And my grandfather was the last person to run it. And of course, Charleston was kind of depressed like so many other southern cities in the 1970s. Everything went kaput on King Street, which is kind of hard to imagine these days.
Yeah.
And the store closed. But as a small child, we always had a piano. They sold records, so we always had records. My mother always played classical music around the house, and had a very kind of colorful childhood. I'd come home from school, we'd have a cup of tea and listen to whatever standard rep she was playing, a Beethoven or Brahms symphony or a Tchaikovsky piano concerto or something like that. Then I'd go out in the yard and play in the dirt for the rest of the afternoon. So it was great. So the classical literature was familiar to me, and I loved it from day one. Started taking piano lessons at 4, and I, even as a child, I knew I wasn't one of those kids that was going to be a big shot pianist. But I liked playing, and often I would fake my way through lessons by telling my teacher, who was my cousin, of course everybody's your cousin around here, that I had that I'd written something for her, just as a way to kill the clock. Of course, I never really wrote anything down, but I'd improvise, and I guess I was charming enough as a child that I got away with it. But I did actually, from time to time, write things down on staff paper. Nothing that I even still have, but so that was how I really came to know and love classical music. Then I, as teenagers do sometimes, got more interested in girls and football and such, and sort of drifted away. Started college as an economics major, and quickly realized that Beethoven was more interesting than the Laffer curve. So I went into composition and told my parents, which seemed like the most audacious, still seems like the most audacious thing I've ever said. I think I'm going to be a composition major, go off, get a master's and doctorate, and come back and teach at the College of Charleston. And when I hear that now, it just sounds totally, what kind of person would say something like that and actually believe it? Well, lo and behold, it kind of worked out.
Happened, yeah.
So that's the long story made long, sorry. But
that's wonderful. Okay, so I guess your first compositions then were improvisations in your lessons.
Right.
What was the first thing, do you remember the first thing that you actually wrote down?
Gosh, I don't know, because it was very young. I remember the first sort of serious, for lack of a better term, piece that I ever wrote, and I'll never forget it because of what somebody said. So in college, I wrote a piano trio, and it was not a bad little piece for a first serious piece. And we had some symphony players performing it, and nice. So I was in a rehearsal of this, and the then chair of the music department, Steve Rosenberg, his daughter, who was maybe 4 or 5, happened to walk in the room and sat down and listened to them perform, and then she turned to me and says, "Is it supposed to sound like that?"
Oh, no.
So that's my first review right there. But but I actually look back on that piece and I see, interestingly, some of the things that I was going to become in terms of style. I mean, love tritones, love major sevenths. I love I have a real ear for certain types of harmony. Mm-hmm. So even then, I think I had some of the DNA that was going to make me a more mature composer.
Do you feel like there are any pieces that you could point to from the early years as a composer that you feel a particular affinity for, or ones that maybe you're proud of? Anything in particular that sort of jumps out?
Well, it depends on how you define the early days. Now, clearly, you can see from my white hair that I've got some mileage on me. And so if by early days you mean, let's say 20s were the early days, just for talking purposes, then yes, I have, there's a piece that I wrote that was really simple. It's a string quartet, a little small string quartet, one movement, 6 or 7 minutes, called The Quiet Hour. And it was based, interestingly, on a painting by a woman named Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith. Mm-hmm. And she was a Charleston painter, active during what was called the Charleston Renaissance, 20s and 30s here in Charleston. And it's a beautiful sort of almost Japanese-inspired painting, and it was a landscape that was very abstract. But the only thing that you really could lock onto was a moon. It was clearly the moon. So I decided that I would try to capture that by, in the string quartet, having a high D above the staff ring the entire time. Somebody always had that note. Cello as a harmonic, or everybody, that note always rang, and everybody kind of worked around that note. And for whatever reason, that piece just seems to have legs. It's a really meditative little piece. It's very simple, and so for whatever reason, that's the piece from the old days that seems to have stuck.
So string quartets must be a big thing because you just finished a big string quartet.
Yeah, I have a piece for string quartet and orchestra, actually,
Yes.
a concerto for string quartet. Yes, which sadly the premiere was postponed due to COVID, and we're very hopeful that it's going to get on here very soon. I think it will. But it was a commission from the Charleston Symphony Orchestra and Shanghai Quartet, and that's a great. Well, I mean, who doesn't want to write for the Shanghai Quartet? I mean, they're one of the great quartets in the world. But it's an interesting concerto setup because it's a little unusual, and you have to figure out, are you writing for the string quartet as a soloist or as four soloists, or do you do some hybrid of that? And that's kind of the approach I took, where they all had solos and duets from time to time, but then every now and then it was quartet versus orchestra, and the interplay between those two groups was fun and challenging. I mean, balance is always an issue, but it's a great excuse to do the sort of Straussian silvery textures with lots of strings, which I enjoy.
Were you thinking in any way about the particular players in that ensemble, or was it more just, okay, this is a string quartet and they can probably do anything I want?
Well, I knew they can play pretty much what I wrote. I mean, they're that good. The way the commission went down was kind of interesting because really they started the commission, and I actually wrote a movement for them sort of as a trial run. I mean, they didn't know me, really know me, and so they wanted to make sure everything was going to go okay, and I don't blame them. So I wrote the first movement, and they performed the first movement up in New Jersey with the Montclair State University Orchestra, and their artist in residence there, and the concert went real well, and they liked the piece, and then so we could move forward with the rest of the commission. But that experience helped me know what they do, and sort of the character of the group, the personalities of the group, and so yes, I think I wrote it the second two movements with that knowledge,
Sure.
which is always fun when you know who you're writing for. It's it's a more satisfying experience because you know what that person or that group does really well or what they like to do.
Now that concerto, if I'm not mistaken, is also tied to this part of the world.
Right. So the title of it is A Charleston Concerto, and interestingly, of all the pieces I've written that are somehow attached to this area, it's the first time I've used the word Charleston in a title. And I guess part of it is, as a young composer, which I was at one point in my life, you don't want to seem too audacious, I guess, and to claim Charleston as your own, you don't want to get ahead of yourself. But once you're north of 50, you get a little mileage, and you're a little less worried about that, and so I did. So the piece is three movements. It's programmatic. It's a concerto really, but it's still a programmatic kind of concerto. So the first movement is called Discovery, and it's the idea behind it is what it must have been like for the first human beings to gaze upon the Charleston Harbor. I mean, surely these are natives, right? So, and obviously it's a speculative exercise, but the way I thought about it is, there's a group of people sort of clawing through the subtropical growth, getting little bits and pieces of wind and breeze and sunlight, and eventually coming upon this beautiful windswept harbor, and what that must have felt like. The second movement is a bit more complicated. It's called Tragedy and Reconciliation, and that really deals with our history. And so the tragedy part is simple enough, right? Well, not simple, I shouldn't say that. It's obvious enough. Any old place has tragedy, and Charleston, at least by American standards, is old. So our tragedies come in lots of different flavors. We have natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes and fires and disease and all this sort of stuff. But of course we have man-made tragedy as well, which is war, civil unrest, and of course the great tragedy for South Carolina and Charleston and the South in general is the act of slavery, of making your fellow humans into property, and that's not a simple thing to deal with. So I wanted to get a sense of all that tragedy, but I guess I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I wanted to look at the other side of the coin, which is reconciliation. And that is, in my mind, not really a one-step act. It's not like, okay, we're reconciled with everything and so be it. It's more of a process, but, it seems like the more you're engaged with the process, the further you can move the ball down the field. And so what I did there was I've always been a very big admirer of Gullah Spirituals. Gullah is a local culture, language, set of practices that was developed primarily on sea islands among Africans that were brought here against their will and their descendants. And while that was a tragic act, there was all this beautiful music that came out of this, and I honestly think it's the great contribution of our area to the American musical lexicon. So, and these are songs I've known all my life, and I actually wrote a dissertation paper on the subject. So I borrowed a couple of these for a couple reasons, and I wanted to be real careful and respectful about this. One is that I don't think you can tell the story of Charleston completely without telling the story of its people, all of its people, and some of it is pretty tough to talk about. And I don't think you can do a musical expression of Charleston without recognizing this enormously important contribution. So, and the particular spirituals that I picked, the words of them sort of had programmatic elements that I thought worked well with the ideas of tragedy and reconciliation. So, as composers are often what I do is you have one that represents one thing, one that represents another, and then of course then they start to wind together to create something different. And I guess what I wanted to leave the listener with is this idea that, okay, we got it, there's been tragedy, yes, we're in a period of trying to reconcile, whether it's again with our fellow man or with Mother Nature, but this is a process that doesn't just wrap up because we say we're reconciled. And so maybe there are still more questions to answer. So that's the most complicated movement by far. And then the last movement is called Tomorrow, because I think at our heart, we in Charleston, all of us are sort of an optimistic bunch, and I think the anecdote that I liked the best was, we had a terrible hurricane here in 1989, Hurricane Hugo. And so I was in graduate school. I came down and got my mother and took her back up to Columbia, where I was in graduate school. Storm blows through. It was awful. Even in Columbia, it was bad. We eventually got power back, turned on the television before we left to go back to Charleston. And there in the Today Show or some news program was Mayor Riley, Joe Riley, our longtime mayor, being interviewed in the middle of Broad Street with piles of rubble around him. And I'll never forget his spirit. I don't know exactly how he said it, but he said, well, this has been pretty bad, but we'll have this place cleaned up in no time. Y'all come on down and see us. But that's it. That's the sort of optimism that I think helps us move forward. So that's, so I wanted to leave on a hopeful and optimistic note, because there's always going to be challenges, but we're going to push ahead.
Well, the piece was supposed to be premiered
at the end of April.
Right.
At the end of April, and I think my sources tell me that hopefully it's going to be programmed for this upcoming season.
Okay.
Well, we
great.
can't wait to hear it.
Me too.
You mentioned your dissertation, and I was wanting to ask you about that because, if I'm not mistaken, it was actually about Gullah Spirituals, and it was specific to John's Island. Is that
right? Where we're sitting right now.
Right.
Right. So, in my DMA program, Doctor of Musical Arts program, the dissertation was a two-part thing. Where, in my case, you wrote a big. I wrote a big orchestra piece, and then a supporting paper, dissertation supporting paper. And my paper was on Gullah Spirituals in prayer meetings on John's Island. So, you want to hear about that?
Please.
Yeah.
So this would have been, this would really date me. So I was writing this in 92.
Okay.
And finished my doctorate in 93. So what I did was I went to various places on John's Island, which is a sea island just south of Charleston, where there was still a sense of Gullah, the culture of Gullah, and of course, whenever you have paved highways and telephones and television, things start to no longer be exactly what they were. Having said that, in 1992, I would have these conversations in these meetings with these natives of John's Island, and mostly they were women, and they would have these prayer meetings, and most of them were in their 70s or 80s. And so these women were born in the early part of the 20th century. So they really came from a different time. And these prayer meetings were just that. They would have a circle of 7 to 12 people. They would talk about what their struggles were in their life. If they had somebody in their family that was sick, or they were having financial trouble, or whatever. And whatever they would say would trigger somebody in the circle to remember a spiritual. And they would just launch right into it. And because it's a call and response type of music making, everybody else just knew exactly when to come in. And it was, it sort of had an improvisational feel to it as well. And people got up and they did what's called shouting, and which is not shouting like we know it. It's a dancing, but it's a very sort of particular type of dance. It's not the Lindy or the Foxtrot. It's because it's not meant to glorify oneself. It's meant to glorify God. And so there's all these sort of stories about you don't cross your feet, and, those sorts of things. But anyway, so the spirituals would come and go based on what was going on in a meeting, and 3 hours later it was over, which was fascinating. And I kind of feel that maybe I was seeing the last really true vestige of this because of the time and the age of these people. And I'm certainly there's some more or less authentic things now, but I felt like what I was seeing was really pretty genuine and organic, and so that's what I wrote the dissertation supporting paper on.
Wow, that's such a neat experience to be able to be there with them and share that with them.
Absolutely. And I will say, I was treated in such a gracious manner. And you think about it, and you kind of have to ask yourself, what in the world would possess these people to treat somebody like me that they didn't know, who was a white man, in such a gracious manner? But they just did, and that really meant a lot to me. It really, it sort of educated me.
And do you feel like the Gullah Spirituals that you were studying have informed your compositions?
I think in some ways. I mean, I think they're I think rhythmically they do. I mean, there's a lot of sort of syncopated patterns that I sort of naturally tend to like in my music. So maybe that's it. I like sort of the call and response feel of things. These spirituals are typically really great little tunes, small tunes full of little hooks, and that's sort of how I think about my music. I mean, Beethoven was right. I mean, you don't need but a few little good hooks, and you're off and running. Right?
The piece that Sandy and I did together was from a set,
Right.
and the poetry was by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Now, that's not the only piece that you've written to text by Paul Laurence Dunbar. So,
Right.
Tell us a little bit about maybe your first introduction to his work
Sure.
and how that all worked.
So, Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African American poet, active at the very tail end of the 19th century and just into the 20th century. He was from Ohio, and I was introduced to him through a commission. I was commissioned to write a set of songs for the African American Art Song Alliance back in 2004. I think it was 2004, so a while back. And the poetry was chosen for me, and so I said it. I mean, it was a little bit awkward's not exactly the right word. I had to think about it a lot because, here I am. Obviously, I'm a white man from Charleston, South Carolina, which has this really interesting history as it relates to the African American experience. Being asked to write music setting this African American poet at the turn of the 20th century that had to deal with his view of the African American experience in that time. All right. I mean, so I kind of had to wrestle with, should I even be doing this? But that was the commission. So okay, I did it. I did it to the best I can. But obviously, it's an act of imagination on my part because clearly I can't really understand what's being said, but I will do my best to the extent that I can understand and set the words that I see before me. And I just, at that point, really became an admirer of Paul Laurence Dunbar. I think he's not given nearly enough credit. He's a major African American poet, and I've learned that he is very highly regarded in certain circles, and he should be taught even more than I think he is. So that's how I got involved with his poetry.
The piece that Sandy and I got to record is the middle of three movements of a set of yours, right?
Right.
And so, would you tell us a little bit about that piece and maybe when you wrote the piece and the experience of writing it, and maybe a little bit about the piece that Sandy and I recorded, which is the hymn.
A hymn. That was the sort of the middle of the three, and I'm sort of a sucker for the fast, slow, fast kind of setup. And so that the hymn was just that. I mean, it had sort of almost a religious or a very thoughtful feel to it. It was originally written, the set was written for an African American soprano in Chicago, and she had a foot sort of in two worlds as a classical singer and also in sort of Broadway / gospel. So, I wanted this to be a piece that sort of kind of sat on the edges between contemporary art song and something more popular, for lack of a better term. And something, I wanted to make it accessible. And so a hymn, I think, at least I attempted to keep it interesting. I mean, I don't think anybody would suspect it was written by Schubert. On the other hand, make it tuneful, make it evocative, make the harmonies rich, but at the same time, try to avoid anybody running screaming from the room. So,
no one's going to do that.
So, who knows? I mean, some people would say it's not a real contemporary piece unless somebody runs away, so maybe it's not.
Oh, but it's a beautiful, beautiful work, and I felt like Sandy sang it so beautifully.
Absolutely, and you played it beautifully.
Thank you.
You two make a great team.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun getting to perform it, and actually, Kayleen and Sandy got to sing another one of your works for two sopranos and piano.
Right, right, yeah, and which is a little bit a different animal than the Dunbar songs. It was trickier, I think, but yeah, that set was setting of works by Amy Lowell, and who was an American poet of the early-ish 20th century from the Boston area, and and it's for soprano and mezzo. Sandy was good enough to sing the mezzo part, and which she did terrifically, and of course Kayleen sang the soprano part beautifully. And it's a little bit of a different bag, but again, even though it's not meant to be quite as much on the seams of popular and contemporary classical, I hope that it remains attractively evocative without turning anybody off. I feel like there's a responsibility, maybe more so in running songs, that it's something that can be sung. I mean, Kayleen, you can sing the spots off the wall, but generally speaking, I am a fan at the end of the day of something that's somewhat idiomatic.
Yeah.
Something that fits in the voice, and it's not necessarily easy. I mean, I think Sandy would be the first to say it's
no, it's not easy to learn.
Not easy to learn because a lot of my music is that way. I mean, it's got
tritones and sevenths.
Tritones and sevenths. That's right, and it's got enough of a foot in tonality that you think it's going to do this, but maybe it doesn't.
Yes.
And so always the struggle with my music is intonation. I mean, with singers or strings, especially when they don't have frets. So but typically, usually the case is that once they get that harmonic language in the ear and set in, those intonation problems start to disappear, and it makes a little bit more sense. At least that's the goal.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, in learning your piece, it at first was a challenge to wrap my head around it, but then once you understand where it's going and when, then it kind of will sing itself in a way.
Locks in.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's the hope, and everybody hopes to create a language that is their own. And Paul, I know you've done this very well as a composer, but to me, I aspire to that. I would love for people to be able to hear something they didn't know that I wrote and say, I think that's Edward Hart, because there's something to that, right? I mean, there are some composers that you need 3 bars, and it's them. Prokofiev, Poulenc. I mean, they've made their own thing, and whether you like their thing or not, there's something to making your own thing, right?
Their own voice. Yeah.
Right.
was curious if you have anything that you could point to as sort of a primary concern of yours as a composer, something that you maybe put first when you're writing. And in a hymn, which we'll be hearing next week, what would you encourage a listener to maybe think about or to listen for as they're hearing your music?
Songs are such a different animal than everything else. Anytime you're dealing with words, words have a meaning. I mean, instrumental music, I can say it means one thing, but at the end of the day, it's abstract. There's no set of notes that mean fire or glass of wine. They're just aren't. But there are words for that, and so it is just a different exercise when you're dealing with actual words, especially in songs. So, I would hope that the listener will think about what words are being set and how it corresponds with the actual music. And I'm not, to be fair, I sometimes, even when I listen to art songs, I get lost in the harmonies and whatnot, in the beauty of the melody, and I don't think about what words are being said. And it's not right. I expect more of my listeners than I do of me, quite frankly. But I think, the act of composing a song is so different because you don't have to come up with meaning. It's right there, and it's whatever you think it means. And you make a lot of compositional decisions based on the words in front of you. So I guess my concern always when writing songs is that, are they going to get it? Are they going to see what turn I did? What change of harmony came here? What is different if I'm doing something kind of strophic, like, okay, so it took a different turn here and it's related to the words. Maybe that's wishful thinking to think that anybody's going to think that, to acknowledge that or to understand it on a single hearing. But I think about it. I think about it a lot when I write the songs. So I guess, I'm frankly a fan, and singers probably hate me for this, but I'm a fan of, even if a song is in English, having words running across a screen. I want it in front of them. I want the audience to immediately see that this word meant that musically. And it's hard to process all that in real time, but you have a better chance if you're not looking at a translation, or if their words aren't written at all. Well, it's in English, everybody's going to understand. I don't know. I'm not that quick. It's over before it started half the times. But if you can see the words coming and say, "Oh wow, that meant that," I think that makes it a more meaningful experience, simply because you have a chance at thinking about what the composer is after. And whereas if you're just trying to hear, I know every singer thinks their diction is marvelous, and, but the fact is, you're trying to hear this beautiful melody or a melody and the words, and figure out what the words mean and keep up with what the music is doing all at the same time. It's a lot to process.
It's a lot, yeah.
It's a whole lot, and it's almost unfair to expect them to. So, I think about Dichterliebe, think about Schumann. It's only as good as the 50th time that you've listened to it, because then now I see. You really see the linkage between the words and what's happening musically. So I guess that would always be my concern with writing art songs. So to the extent that somebody could really kind of immerse themselves in the words and music at the same time with a hymn, I would hope that would be a more meaningful experience for them. I read a biography on Strauss not too long ago, and this guy was writing these operas, and he was conducting, and he was teaching, and he had his family. Obviously I'm not Strauss. So I guess I shouldn't complain, but it does feel like it's sometimes that I have to write in the cracks. You know, you've got 30 minutes to do something, and you better make it happen. There's no waiting to be inspired. Just you better get to it. And so I guess I've adapted to that type of time. You know, I guess in a perfect world I'd have hours and hours to sit and work on things, because I'm not a fast composer. And for me, and I don't know if this works this way for you, Paul, it's that first part of the compositional process which is the hardest. Because you know, you try to figure out, at least I try to figure out what the DNA of the piece is before I really start running with it. And that DNA could be really simple. It could be just a couple little motives, or some sort of hook, or some sort of harmonic construction, or combination of those things. A melodic thing that is also a harmonic thing and is also a rhythmic thing. And because, you know, the act of composition, frankly, I used to tell my composition students this, is making a lot of music out of a little music. I mean, you really don't have that much music, but the craft is making something work with that. And now, you don't want to make the tail wag the dog, but on the other hand, you don't want to write the first 15 good ideas off the top of your head and say, oh, well, that seems like enough time. Right? So, but that process of getting that original DNA, what is this piece going to do musically, and how can I create something that I can really use to spread out and do something meaningful. I mean, is that maybe it's only my problem?
No, not at all. I mean, I'll spend months just thinking about something, you know, before I ever set the proverbial pen to paper. You know, it's usually pencil, I guess.
Yeah, I work with pencil too.
But absolutely, I mean,
and I'm sure that part of that is also because you're kind of like composing in the cracks, like you said, like trying to. It's hard to get those blocks of time where you can just leisurely think about what you're going to do with it.
Right. But the best moments, though, to me, the most exciting moments in the compositional process is when you've got the DNA. You got it. You know what it is. You know what your material is, and then you can walk around with it. And then you can literally, I mean, I like to walk. You walk and you think about and you process how the use of material and how you spread this material out over time in an effective way as it relates to form, and sort of what's supposed to happen and when it happens, and what the expectation from the listener is, and do you fulfill that, do you not fulfill that, when it's time to do this or do that. And then you only need to, and it's hard to teach, and because maybe it's not an exact science, but you only need to look at certain composers to really get a sense of that. I mean, for me, Chopin's a great example. I mean, Chopin, these little small pieces, whether they're ballades or whatever they are, you know, he just seems to have a knack to know exactly when there's enough of this, and now we're going to that. And we're going to bring that back, but we're not going to do it the way we did it before. We're going to do it like this. And you've heard this harmony do this the entire time, but now we're going to turn the knife at the very end and do something slightly different. I mean, all those little decisions seem so organic, but it requires you to really know that DNA, really know the material. You know, at least that's my take. And what about you, Paul?
No, I love hearing your perspective on this. I can't say that it always happens in the same way to find that DNA. You know, sometimes I find that it's kind of a sudden thing, that all of a sudden you have that one little thing that you need to build everything else around it. And other times it's been more finding something that for some reason seems important, and I'm not sure why, and just experimenting with that, and then you find something else, and then somewhere along the road you realize that they actually fit together, you know, and that's actually, those little pieces comprise the DNA, like you said.
Well, do you ever have this experience? Because I do, and I think a lot of composers probably do, where you do something that's really, really, you feel is clever, and you know it's clever, but you also know that no one's going to get it. No one's going to get it. I wrote a violin concerto some years ago, and there's this one moment in the last movement where I took, I don't know, maybe 6 of the sort of thematic elements, and I built them up one by one in a chamber ensemble, then add strings, and I basically had the entire concerto happening contrapuntally all at one time, and then going back to its original little motive in a solo cello, and I thought, that's it. That's the best moment of this. And there's no way in the world that somebody sitting in the audience and going, oh, he just added the second theme from movement 2 there, but at the same time he changed the tonal center. I mean, they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that. But I know it, and you want to say, hey, by the way, guess what's going on here? Let me just stop right here and tell you how clever this is. We don't get that luxury, I don't think, unfortunately.
But I wonder if, on some level, even a subconscious level, if sometimes those types of moments can for some reason shine through or make an impact because of the way that you so carefully crafted it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm betting on that. I mean, and I tell my students that all the time, that when you use material again in interesting ways that you've used before, people who are hearing it for the first time may not say, oh, well, that's that accompanying theme that he's using now as a main theme, or he's doing that in an inversion, or whatever it is. But the bet is, while they might not be able to say that, they know the neighborhood.
Do you have any moments that you remember that were sort of those types of moments of finding the DNA that were particularly kind of exciting for you, or hard-won, perhaps?
Hopefully you always have a moment where it all sort of comes together. I think one of the fun things is when you discover that this idea will actually work with that idea. Like, wait a minute, that actually works at the same time, or that works in a canon, or that works when you invert it. And again, all these things are just sort of nerdy composer things, but that's what we do. We because otherwise you're just sort of spinning notes. It's great to be able to find interesting ways to combine material. And again, I guess we all owe a debt to Beethoven, because that's his thing. I mean, other people did it too, of course, but for him, it was relentless, and we were going to have this material, this small amount of material, and this is it. We're going to stick with it, and even if you don't even realize it's happening, it's there. And that's why I used to love, back when I would teach music appreciation, is to open these students' eyes to really what's going on here. You teach the Fifth Symphony, and you'd say, okay, you all know the hook from the first movement, but did you know that this rhythmic hook is the DNA of the entire piece? And let's figure out how that works, and let me point it out to you and show you. And it's just marvelous to see people go, oh, wow, this guy was a genius.
How do you find a balance between the craft that you're talking about, which is this intentional and conscious aspect of what you do, and then allowing room for yourself to express what needs to be expressed, and how does that all tie together? Because at least in my experience, I find that you mentioned the word clever. Sometimes I can be very proud of something that I think is clever, but it's just not honest.
Right.
And it doesn't really say much, and it might be interesting on paper, and then other times I get out of my way, and I maybe there's not much craft there, but there's something real, and that can actually work.
Right. I was having this conversation with someone recently. I think it was our colleague Blake Stevens, our musicologist, about Brahms. Well, Brahms. I'm no Brahms, and I have no business criticizing Brahms at all, but I'll do it anyway. Brahms wrote some of the greatest tunes ever written, but sometimes he couldn't get out of his own way because he was so relentless in his motivic development that he didn't let something just sit and have the air that it needed. And so, we talk about this craftsmanship, and I do think it's important, but you got to be careful not to let the tail wag the dog there. You want, I want, not every composer feels this way, but I mean, at the end of the day, I want my music to move somebody. And in order to move, people aren't always moved by craftsmanship. Yeah. They're moved by wonderful melody and harmony and interesting musical moments. And if you let your desire to do something clever get in the way of that, then you've got a problem. I mean, in my view, but some composers look at that differently. I mean, it's all about the clock making part of the procedure, and I admire that. But why are we even doing it? I mean, you could write code for a computer and have the same.
Yeah.
Well, it's all about ego too, right? I mean, we all have a different sort of psychological makeup, and some of us need more praise than others. And so, your mother is always going to like what you do, so that doesn't count. So it'd be nice to have somebody else like what you do, and you're not going to get everybody. You got to get comfortable with the fact that what you do is going to be strange to some people, and they're just not going to get it. That's fine. Yeah. I mean, because people are people, but you almost would rather have the compliment from somebody who didn't know anything about music than somebody who's an expert in music or a so-called expert in music. I mean, to me, that's almost a better compliment. Somebody said, it's strange, I couldn't figure it out, but I really liked it. Well, that's a great compliment. I'll take that all day long. Yeah. That in a lot of ways that's more genuine and heartfelt than, oh, well, I see what you did in the second movement by turning the tone upside down. Well, okay, great, and I'm glad you recognize that. But did it move you? Well, maybe or maybe not. I mean, after all, I think that's what we're in the business of doing, not just creating beautiful equations, but moving people. Yeah. And if I wanted beautiful equations, I'd have done a different business. So let's talk about art songs for you. Okay. You guys, I noticed sing an art song or two from time to time, perform one together. What do you want to see in an art song?
Well, what you were just talking about really resonated with me, because one of the things that I always strive for in any kind of performance is communicating the whatever human experience is present in the score, and bringing that music to life, and just hopefully trying to draw a line from the composer's heart to the audience member's heart, and just trying to bridge that gap, I guess.
Well, I have another question.
Okay.
So what is it like writing a piece that your wife, your soulmate, is going to sing? That's got to be a different experience than writing from somebody you don't know or don't know well, or somebody that's not your wife. Tables are turned here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I probably abuse it to some extent, because I know that I can say, hey, try this out for me, and see, I can actually get her to test run it.
Although you don't always do that. And you just assume,
right.
like, I think she'll be able to do that.
I didn't want to start anything here. So. That's not my goal.
No, but it's, of course, I know Kayleen's voice very well. And I feel like I can audiate that quite well.
Well, there is a piece that's in the works, for example, where you're like, okay, well, I know that it's long, so we're just gonna. It's not gonna be that complicated, really. We're not gonna have
that's
like.
a bad sign if a composer says that.
We're not,
That's a bad sign.
we're not gonna use any quarter tones or anything. You'll be fine. So I started looking. I mean, I don't know how much time I spent, but it took me a while to get through a couple of pages. And these pages don't have many measures on each page because they're they're very dense rhythmically and pitch-wise all over the place, full of accidentals.
What kind of composer would do that to you?
Right? And so then I was like, okay, I'm gonna jump ahead. Where should I go? And Paul said, well, actually, I thought you were gonna start at one of the more challenging parts.
Uh-oh.
So, I was like,
I have
that
faith.
wasn't one of the challenging parts already?
I have faith in your talent.
Well, I mean, and that faith is well placed. I mean, I've seen Kayleen sing some very difficult pieces. But okay, so let me ask this. Let's say someday I'm honored with the agreement, invitation to write something for the two of you.
Oh, we'd love that.
What is it that you want?
Ooh.
What kind of thing would inspire you? Is it the virtuoso thing? Is it the emotional thing? Is it the what is in your wheelhouse?
Okay, that's really interesting because I love a really good challenge and being able to have a really hard time with a score, but then getting to the end and saying, okay, yes, look what I did.
Right.
But I always really love a good melody that is maybe not, it doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly idiomatic or tonal, but it's something that will stick in your head, and it's something that, I don't know, that really expresses the emotion of the text.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like lyricism and, flowing lines and things like that.
I think for me, it's about seeing a narrative in a song cycle, right? And sort of taking this journey from beginning to end, and that something meaningful happens along the way. And I'm partial to writing that doesn't celebrate extra notes, just I'd rather explore the colors and the sounds that are created with just a few meaningful things than a lot of extra superfluous nonsense. So
right. Well, that's refreshing from a pianist, because pianists tend to like superfluous nonsense from time to time. Not all pianists, but some.
I would always tend towards the poetic on
right.
the front. Did you have any parting thoughts for us, or for people that will experience your music soon when they hear a hymn? Well,
I hope they enjoy it, and it's. I've always said that good players make a composer sound good, and we you and Sandy did a terrific job with it, and that makes all the difference. And that at some point I would aspire to write something for the two of you someday. So
thank you. We would love that.
Sounds like a wonderful plan. We would be honored.
Decide on the poetry, and we'll move ahead at some point.
Can't wait.
That'll be a fun project.
So we'll be back with another video when that happens, then, won't we? Or several.
That's right. Yep, that's right. And we have 2021 knocking on the door now, and it's got to be better. I mean, gee whiz, it's got to be better.
Cheers.
Yes.
Here's to
Thank
you.
you, Edward.
Cheers.
Cheers. Salud.